What's up, collectors? Welcome back to Films by Color. I've got another episode of Criterion Corner for you today. I hopped on a call with my good buddy Connor, and we had a great discussion about the 1931 film M. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. All right, here we are back again in the Criterion Corner doing another discussion video with my buddy Connor Nielsen. Welcome back to the program, sir. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Excited to talk to you about this because this is your pick. We go back and forth on this show. Last time I picked After Hours, and this time you've picked another movie that takes place mostly at night. Well, not mostly, but the climax is a big nighttime scene. And let's talk a little bit. Let's just go ahead and talk about your background a little bit. What made you pick this? When did you first see this? What's your history with this? Because I have no history with this. This is my first time watching this. So thank you for introducing me. Well, not introducing me, but thank you for getting me to watch this for this discussion. And take it away. I'm going to let you, lead a little bit since this was your pick.
Yeah, so this is Fritz Lang's 1931 film M. This is his first sound film.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it's his 13th movie. I think he made a dozen movies in the silent era. And his previous film was Metropolis. And how amazing is it that you can make a movie that is so expensive that it completely bankrupts your studio and you still get to have work after it. But it's directed by Fritz Lang, and like
this film was not expensive though. This is a much lower budget film. So he had to reel it in a little bit.
Maybe a little bit, but like his previous efforts, the screenplay here is penned by his then wife Thea von Harbo, although this one is co-written by Lang and Harbo as opposed to directed by Lang, written by Harbo.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of those like Connor Nielsen origin movies where it's like 2010, 2011. I'm just getting into movies. I find out what the Criterion Collection is. I've seen M. Like I'm familiar with the idea of the movie. I've seen this cover around a bunch. When I go over to Barnes and Noble, and this is back in the day when the Criterion Collection is just on Netflix, and so I watch 8.5 that way. I watch The Killing that way.
I didn't know that.
And I watch M. Maybe I talked about this a little bit when we talked about The Killing, but I have like a story that or like an idea for a movie that I kind of came up with while I was in high school, and it's like a heist thing. And I've always kind of said it's like my take on The Killing, and I don't feel super hacky about saying that because like every heist movie is just someone's take on The Killing. But I didn't realize that like this movie owes like that idea I have owes just as much to this movie as it does to The Killing. Yeah, so that's sort of like my history with it. I watched this movie like 3 or 4 or 5 times in high school. I really fell in love with Peter Lorre because after watching this, shortly after I watched Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon, and I really liked him in The Maltese Falcon. I know that character and performance has sort of been, a little seen as kind of like the regressive stereotype, but I don't know. I just think his performance as Joel Cairo is awesome. But yeah, I really kind of like during this junior year of high school, fall in love with Peter Lorre, Fritz Lang. But the reason I wanted to pick this is I knew I wanted to eventually do this on Criterion Corner because this movie is, if not like on my list of favorites, I do kind of recognize it as a sort of foundational movie in my appreciation for world cinema and classics. And I never even really thought about this as like an early sound movie, but it really is. And especially now we can get into it. I really got to see it kind of as this really neat transitionary like piece of Lang from his silent work to his talkie work. The reason why I picked this now is because Scorsese in his After Hours commentary compares the main character of that movie to a Lang protagonist, someone who's sort of doomed by fate. And that's something you had actually referenced in our discussion on After Hours, and M was something I wanted to reference in our After Hours discussion, and like a bunch of stuff you and I just forgot to talk about because there's so much to talk about with After Hours.
Mhm.
And I thought I could have mentioned it in a text message to DJ that I kind of got a little bit of M vibes off of After Hours, or I could waste an entire video of us talking about M. So let's do that. We're talking about it now. I think that especially when you get to like the second half of this movie, there's a lot going here that I think Scorsese was looking at. And not just that, I feel like this is one of the great film procedurals, and specifically manhunt movies. So I think Kurosawa's High and Low would play like gangbusters in a double feature with this movie. I think that Kurosawa is absolutely looking at this movie when he's making High and Low. But I think the likes of The French Connection and Blade Runner even owe a great debt to this movie. Anyways, DJ, what did you think of M?
All right. So did you rewatch it for this discussion, or you've seen it so many times you didn't even know?
Oh yeah, I if I have an excuse to rewatch it, I'm going to rewatch M.
Okay. So I basically forgot we were doing this until you reminded me like 2 days ago. So I only have had one day with this film, but I've seen it twice. I watched it twice yesterday. I watched it on lunch through in its entirety, and then I watched it after I put the kids to bed because my wife's out of town, and I watched it again with the commentary track that is on here, with two film historians, or one film historian and one like German political historian or something. Very, very good commentary. So I've seen it twice. I've heard it once, and I've heard it once with commentary. And the first time, I was like, okay, I think this is a movie that I can appreciate and respect and admire, but I don't. It's not really a movie that I like enjoy or that I had like a strong emotional connection to. But as often happens, and as I assumed would happen with this, as I learned more about the history of it, the filmmaking of it, and the time period that it was made in, I do like it a lot more. It's still not like still not a movie that's like made for me. I'm not a big crime movie fan in general. I think I got like 10 minutes into this movie and I'm like, what is Connor making me watch? Like a serial child murderer. I was surprised by how dark it was. I have, like I said, I had really no history with it. Like you, I've seen it, I've heard about it, I knew it was by Fritz Lang. I think you've mentioned it a couple times, but I did not know how crazy dark it was for the time, especially. I mean, compared to the stuff we were making in the 30s over in America. I think I will like it more and more every time I see it. Like you have, it's really fascinating, especially the stuff like you said, where you can see him experimenting with sound film. This is like that transitional period where we're switching from silent era to sound era, and apparently, how do you say it? I've listened to so many people talk about it, and I've heard it Fritz Long and I've heard it Fritz Lang, both ways.
I say Lang, but I mean it could be, Long.
Yeah. Oh, anyway, I'll say Lang for simplicity sake. But yeah, he was apparently he was really resistant to sound. Like a lot of directors were like scared of sound. They didn't want to like mess with it. It was very restricting. It added limitations because the microphones, really limited what you could do. So the freedom and flexibility that they had during the silent era to kind of do whatever they want with shots was kind of hindered. And so he was resistant to it for a long time. But then when he finally did do it with this, he didn't just do it. He was very purposeful with the sound. And watching it a second time, noticing all that stuff, like actually the first time, one of the big things I noticed is like I believe they're called sound bridges, where the sound for the next scene will start before the scene switches, and then it'll like transition right into the next scene, which stood out to me even on the first viewing, which was very interesting because I don't even see that. I mean, we do it today, but he does it specifically in a jarring way. There's that big one where they're reading the poster and someone's yelling at him to like speak up in the back, and then a voice comes on, and you think it's someone reading the poster, and then it switches to the next scene. It's the guys in the club, and he's reading the newspaper, and you're like, for a second, a little bit confused what's going on. And there's a couple of those. I guess that's the takeaway is his use of sound was way ahead of his time and really influential.
Yeah, the craft is something I really picked up on this time around. So I think what's interesting about this movie is I watched this movie quite a few times, like I said, in high school. And then this Blu-ray I got, this is, I think, my first Criterion acquisition.
That's awesome.
Like, yeah, I don't know how, like, I've had this Blu-ray for a long time.
It's got a very thick booklet. I haven't had, like I said, I only had a day with this, so I haven't had a chance to read this yet, but
it's an interesting booklet because it includes like 5 or 6 different articles, but they're all short. So like there's something called The Mark of M, which is only like 2 pages. There's a deleted scene, but it's only the dialogue, so it doesn't say who says it, so you kind of have to piece together what's happening.
Weird.
There's an interview with Fritz Lang, or a piece by Fritz Lang, which is like 6 pages, and that's like the longest thing in there. But it's all very informative, and that's like the stuff I'm familiar with. I've not actually looked at a lot of the on-disc bonus features, so I really, really want to see. It's William Friedkin sitting down with Fritz Lang to talk. William Friedkin, the recently deceased filmmaker who gave us The French Connection and The Exorcist. It's no wonder that guy likes Fritz Lang, but I'd love to see that because if nothing else, William Friedkin's a personality and a half. So I would love to see that. And there's also an English language version of M, which is something we can maybe get into later, but that's an entire fad of the early days of talkies that it's fascinating in its own right. But I've not looked at a lot of the on-disc supplements. I'm actually pretty intimately familiar with this booklet because I've read it probably 2 or 3 times over the years. So I see this movie a few times in high school. I really like it, but it's one of those things that I appreciate on like a 2001: A Space Odyssey level, or something like 8.5, where like I'm watching it and I'm like, I understand that there's a lot going on here that like I can't process, and like it's like I'm aware enough to know that it's going over my head, but there is like some kind of connection that I'm feeling with it that isn't like superficial. Like it's not just, oh wow, well, it's well made. It's like it's well made in a way that feels like it's properly expressing something. But I lack the experience to like connect with it. But I just have a real soft spot for Fritz Lang. But the kind of feverish connection and love that I'm feeling, is for Metropolis. That's like a movie that is just on my level when I'm in high school. I love how big and bombastic it is. I love how Wagnerian it is. And then when you get to this, it's a lot less that way. And when I watch stuff like the Maltese Falcon or other film noir, like I'm like, oh, this has much more in common with those than Metropolis does.
Huge inspiration on the whole genre of film noir.
This is like the proto noir.
Yeah.
So last year, my brother and I were actually watching through just like the Criterion Collection movies I own, kind of in spine order sequence. And eventually, like Spencer moved down to LA, and then I think this was like the first or second one that I watched by myself, and I hadn't seen it in like 9-10 years. And it was a very interesting experience because as I was watching it, I was liking it, but I'm like, I like it, but it's not like great the way that like I remembered it being great, or the way that I think Metropolis is great. And then like that second half, I think second half of this movie is like one of the greatest things ever. Like it is so gripping and thrilling and exciting. And I was like, okay, amazing. Like I want to watch this again sometime soon. And maybe I will have like a better appreciation for the first half. Because it's not that I dislike the first half, but I do see the first half as a little bit of like, it's like in real time you're watching Fritz Lang go through the growing pains of understanding non-silent cinema. And so, and it's like almost like you're watching him kind of trial and error it, and then boom, he just understands it. For like the second half, it's like perfect. And I'm like, oh, cool, like great. So what's interesting about this movie is the structure is pretty odd. Like it's a pretty strangely structured movie. The first 20 minutes feel like a silent movie, but in sound form. And I think like he's making it the way he would make his silent movies. He's not really toned down the expressionism much. I think the reason why it doesn't feel like Metropolis or Die Nibelungen is because they don't have a musical score. And if you watch those other kind of big epic silent movies, like the music is just slamming you over the head with how big it is.
Yeah, very interesting choice by him. Apparently that was deliberate to raise the tension, because there's even scenes that have no sound at all. And that wasn't like a necessity. That was a deliberate choice, he said, like, because he could have added in. He only recorded like, I think 2/3 of the film. I think he recorded 2/3 of the film silent and only 1/3 with sound. So he's obviously adding in Foley a lot. But for those specific scenes where he chooses not to put in Foley, which he easily could have, because it's just like cars driving and like people's footsteps, but he deliberately like leaves it silent, especially like that scene, the heavily looking noir scene before the police raid, where it's just like dead silent, and all of a sudden it's like whistles out of nowhere, like people just start running in. So he's doing that on purpose to like raise the tension. I actually had to like check the settings. I was like, did I mess something up? What's going on? Why did the sound drop out? And then it started going again. I was like, okay, I'm an idiot.
That reminds me, you've seen Dracula, right? Like the Todd Browning 1931 Dracula.
I saw it once a couple years ago in October.
The first Frankenstein and the first Dracula movie kind of have the same thing that this does, where all three of these came out in 1931, and they're very early sound pictures, and it's very sparse when it comes to sound, and like especially in like Dracula and Frankenstein, the only music you hear in that movie is like off the top, like the title card and the opening credits, and then there's no more music. Mm-hmm. And in the case of those movies, like I think it lends a sort of dryness to those movies that I don't feel here. I think in the case of M, it's not dry. It does add to that tension, like similar to what
it works. It's creepy.
It reminds me of like Diabolique, like the ending of that movie, where there's just no music at all, and it's like nerve shredding tension. But what's interesting is in those first 20 minutes, the acting is very similar to like silent movie acting, and like the way it sort of is. There's no introductions to like main characters. Like it does almost feel like a pseudo documentarian. Like it kind of reminds me of Hexen, actually.
Yeah. It is very documentary style, very different from what I'm used to for Fritz Lang, and the city is the main character. Like there's no main character. I mean, you get to know by the end, you get to know the murderer, Beckett, Hans Beckett. But for the majority of the movie, you're just jumping back and forth. You get like names here and there, like the police chief and like one of the head criminals. I don't think we get a name, but we see him a couple times. But for the most part, you're just jumping from character to character the whole time, which is really cool.
It's like a snapshot of like just like a city under paranoia, like a populace under paranoia.
Yeah, I love those scenes. Like when you see everyone like turning on each other. Like there's those guys shouting at each other and accusing each other, and then you've got there's one guy who's just like a pickpocket that the police is escorting out, and then he says, "I'm not the murderer," and they're like, "Murderer!" And then they all start grabbing him, and like there's like
and that's the thing. It's like all that feels very silent movie to me, because it's like it's best if you don't view that stuff as like 100% literally. It's more expressive of like a general feeling, where it's like people don't literally act like this, but because it's expressive, like, and that's where like the kind of German expressionist flair is still permeating like Lang's style here, where it's like people are paranoid, so like they're literally accusing people from across the street, as the guy was reading like the news article, and like you have like the great shot where it's like you see little Elsie Beckman bouncing her ball against like the the sign that is like, a 10,000 franc like marks reward for whoever catches the murderer, and then you see his shadow cast upon it. Like, it feels more expressive of a feeling and an idea. And I think like the shot that feels the most expressionistic to me is, and like the scene that feels the most expressionistic to me is, it's like this kind of elongated like bit where you have like the chief of police talking to the secretary, and it's like that feels kind of like a documentary where it's like, okay, we need to, instead of it being a talking head explaining it, we're going to have a talking head. Instead of a talking head explaining it to a camera, we're going to have a person behind a desk explaining it to another person on the phone. And so they're kind of explaining, look, when it comes to these types of things, like there are all kinds of fake leads. There are all kinds of like clues that we could pick up on. Like, just think about, like, we found like a candy wrapper. Now, could that be a clue, or could that just be a red herring? We don't know, but we have to expand the radius every day. And every day people remember less and less. And it's like this really cool shot where it's like you see somebody using like a pencil compass, and it's like you see them expanding the radius. And that shot is so silent movie, where it's like you see the crime scene has sort of been made in miniature and it's been placed on top of a map, and you're seeing like a big hand expanding the radius. Now, that's not a literal shot. It's a very expressionistic shot. But like that felt to me like so in line with Fritz Lang's silent movie work. But then later in the movie, you sort of see that sort of style leave once the first 20 minutes passes. And there's a similar shot where you see the head criminal, safecracker. He's sort of explaining how they're going to use the beggars to like sort of, canvass the city and be their lookouts. And you see his gloved hand sort of like pointing and like making circles over a map. And it calls to mind that earlier shot, but it's less expressionistic now. It's more like, but it conveys a similar idea. Like, I don't know. I thought that stuff was just awesome. I've been kind of going on a little long here. No. If you want to respond to any of that, go ahead.
No, I totally agree. I think, all that stuff that really stood out to me was the editing choices and the sound choices. Like, this is what I want. Like, I don't want us to rest on our laurels and use sound as a crutch. Like, I love silent filmmaking. I love visual storytelling, and to use that as the main focus and then use sound only when it's necessary and important and it enhances things, instead of just like, well, the default is just to have sound. So I don't know. I feel like we lose something when we use it as a crutch like that. Or I feel like every little bit of sound in this movie was intentional. Like, there's so many little tiny things. And I really picked up on a second viewing. First viewing, like I said, I was more like picking up on the editing and that kind of stuff, because I wasn't latching on too much to the story as sad, obviously as sad and like horrifying as it is. I wasn't, because we don't have like a protagonist or even like characters. I'm not like connecting on a personal level.
Like a bird's eye view type thing. Like,
I'm kind of
emotional arm's length.
Yeah, I've got an arm's length from what's going on, and I'm just viewing it as this sterile police investigation. Whereas we're not like we get the opening scene with the mother and the ending scene with the mothers, which is heartbreaking. But you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And I will say, you mentioned this. The first shot we get of his silhouette on the poster, and we get another shot of him writing a letter from the back. We do this really good job of hiding his face for a while. And then the first shot of his face is a very strange choice, or at least I thought so the first time I watched it. Because I was like, well, that was weird. We didn't even build up. We had all this build up, and then we didn't do anything menacing or scary at all. He's like just acting like a goofball in front of a mirror. But on, after I've seen the movie and I've seen the ending and I know what they're doing with that character, it makes a lot more sense than when I thought they were trying to make him just this menacing villain. Mm-hmm. He's supposed to be, he's I don't know if he's supposed to be fully sympathetic, but we're supposed to understand him at least. I don't think we're supposed to sympathize with him at all. Maybe a little, but it's not like a psycho situation. Like it's definitely not like a Norman Bates or, I can't imagine anyone watching this and siding with that side. It's not really a decision at the end. I think it's more of just like, he's definitely showing his hand a lot with the way he presents it, even though he does. That scene's great, obviously. And Peter Lorre is so much of the reason why this movie works. Like, it's not just Lang like that. Good grief, that monologue is, and he just lingers. He doesn't cut. Like, he barely ever cuts. It's just like a one long monologue that just keeps going.
That for the longest time was like so when I was in high school, I'd say like my favorite actor is Jack Nicholson. My second favorite actor is Peter Lorre. And I think to this day, like Peter Lorre is like the character actors I tend to notice have a Peter Lorre quality to them. But also like, I don't know, like that monologue, I found the clip on YouTube and I would just show it to people in high school. Like, this is acting. Like, this is so good.
And he did it in 2 languages.
Yes.
He did it in French.
Yeah.
They did a French version of this, and weirdly, they did do subtitles for most of it, but they reshot some scenes, and they reshot like the poster scene they reshot with a French poster and like a French letter, and they actually cast some actors as French actors, and Peter Lorre just did the whole scene again in French, and they used that in the French version.
Okay, I've not watched the English language version, but like the little menu, gives you a little tidbit where it's like the monologue could be seen as Laurie's English language debut. So did he
did it in English too? I didn't.
I guess
see
he did
that.
it in 3 languages.
So I did watch a lot of the bonus features. I wasn't able to watch the Friedkin thing or the documentary because it was really long, and I would have been like another film almost. But I did get to watch most of the features on the Criterion channel, and there's one that you have to watch for sure because it's called A Physical History of M. And it goes through all the different versions when they cut it down, and then when they found the footage and like restored it back. And like there's a French version, like I said, that they released where they reshot stuff and used different footage for. They even used that scene, that monologue, in a Nazi propaganda film. Completely pulled it out of context and just tried to make it an example of like criminality. Like it's terrible. It's horrible because they actually liked this film. The Third Reich liked this film because they thought it was pro capital punishment. Like Joseph Goebbels like literally asked Lang to be their director, and he did the right thing. Said no, it fled the country, but like he had the opportunity to be. So
you're touching on a whole thing. Okay, so Hitler loved Fritz Lang, and apparently Metropolis was one of Hitler's favorite movies, and like it's that all that stuff is kind of interesting because I think a lot of people can, with hindsight, look at Metropolis and be like, did they miss the message of the movie? And I'm like, okay, like I think you can watch Metropolis, and because Metropolis is a fable, politics is it touches on broad subjects. Like I think every political movement or ideology or whatever, it needs to have opinions on broad subjects, but how it has opinions on those broad subjects is a very nuanced, complicated thing. But Metropolis is a fable and a fairy tale, and like
which
those are broad. And so like I can understand how someone could just map their own ideology onto Metropolis and be like, okay, it agrees with me. I like the style, so it agrees with me now. And so it's like I could see how that happens. But when it comes to this, I'm a little like, I find that a little more interesting. But anyways, what's interesting though is
you could do the same thing with this. I think
I guess so. And oh my, I'm sorry, I'm a little scatterbrained here. I want to
because it is interesting how this has some parable-esque. It's kind of a parable too because it's not. Even though it's very documentary style, it's not like they throw out the number like 4.5 million people in this city like affected by this, which you don't get that scope. Like he does a really good job of giving it a scope, even though it's all shot on sets and not locations. Mm-hmm. But it's not that big of a scope. Like you still are just seeing like one little street of people mostly, and it's like a parable for what happens to big cities when they go through trauma like this. But I mean, obviously it's not the same thing as Metropolis, but it's interesting how there's a little bit of that in this too, even though it's so documentary style.
And so what I think, like, so Fritz Lang has just the most striking cinematography, and it's not just that it looks pretty, it does, but like it's very dramatic, low angles. Like early on, there's this great tracking shot, overhead tracking shot of like a table where like guns and knives and all that stuff.
The inventory shots, those are crazy.
like that kind of filmmaking is it punches you. It's very striking. It's cool.
There's one with the beggars too, where they have all this like food and cigarettes and stuff.
Yeah, and that shot is awesome because it goes. It's sorry, you're just opening up more boxes that I want to talk on, and I'm getting more scatterbrained. But the point is, like, I think like when someone like, you know, like Hitler can just like look at that stuff, and you know, it's easy to kind of map on whatever you believe and like kind of see a confirmation bias there. But what's interesting is like, yeah, they did ask Hitler to like, sorry, they did ask Lang, like the Third Reich asked Lang like, we love you. We will ignore your Jewishness and make you an honorary Aryan. And he was like, I'm going to Hollywood. And he did.
Get me out of here.
But what's interesting, though, is that his wife, Thea von Harbo, stayed around and joined the Nazi Party.
Jeez.
And that is fascinating to me. And so I don't know, like, I'd be curious to know, like, all the backstory, like, behind, like, who these people were on a personal level, what they wanted to convey through their art, like. And what's interesting is that, like, you know, it's easy for Lang to get out of Germany and look at history and be like, I can maybe make myself look like a nicer guy than I maybe it's impossible to know, right? But like maybe there's some myth making going on with Lang there.
Apparently there's a lot. Like apparently he's known for not really telling the truth in interviews. They even have like in one of the interviews on the disc, they have like a disclaimer at the beginning that's like, he's not really known for telling the truth. So whether this happened or not, you can at least tell that he's a good storyteller or something like that.
Yeah, and like that's probably responsible for them. But here's oh boy, like we're getting into the whole like history of like Nazi Germany and all, but like it's kind of hard.
I wish I knew more about that. Like I would appreciate
too.
This so much more if I did.
It's interesting. I knew all about the stuff of like Hitler and the Third Reich and Metropolis. I did not know about that with this movie though, and that's fascinating to me. Now to maybe make myself just look like the worst person in the world, because I didn't know. Film. I have not seen that film. I own it though. But to make myself look like a horrible, horrible person, like morally disgusting. One thing that I found was, and this is something I didn't know we would be talking about Hitler and the Third Reich in this.
Well, if this makes the edit, we'll see.
If this makes the edit, anyways,
we'll see where this goes.
Recently, A.O. Scott. Do you know who A.O. Scott is?
I don't think so.
He was a film critic for, I want to say, the New York Times for a very, very long time.
Oh, no.
Great film critic. He was one of the replacements on At the Movies after Ebert and Roper weren't doing it anymore. He was a guest filming in for Ebert for a long time. I really like A.O. Scott. And he recently stepped down in March from film criticism. And I think film criticism is just in the toilet. And I think him taking a step away from it has only given a further blow to the credibility of film criticism right now. But in his goodbye letter, he said something that I agree with. He said, "The thing I love most about the movies is their ability to obliterate reason and abolish taste. You know the jump scare is coming, but you jump anyway. You suspect you should be offended by the joke, but you laugh helplessly in spite of yourself. Why are you crying? You don't really know, but you can't argue with tears." Unquote. That's what I've learned that I like a lot about movies, is their ability to kind of warp your perspective. And what I find interesting about this is how kind of cynical this movie is by the end of it. Now, I don't really consider myself a super cynical person when it comes to people. I'm very cynical when it comes to like businesses and corporations and whatnot, and just kind of the way the business side of the world works. But like when it comes to people, I'm not. This movie though is just so cynical in a way that like I find that's kind of provocative, because you have the murderer, and it's a child murderer. It's like the worst possible conceivable person in the like what is something no one would defend. Nobody would defend child murder. And so you have
even the guy who was literally defending him in the kangaroo court is like, I'm your defense attorney. I don't know what good it'll do. Like,
but then you sort of give the child murderer in the end sort of the last word when it comes to sympathy. He has this whole ongoing thing about like why he is the way he is, and the shame and the guilt and all this thing. And as a sympathetic viewer, I can't help but feel bad for him. And the cruelty that the criminals are inflicting on him, I sort of second guess it. And it's shocking to me that I would feel that way. And so,
Yeah, interesting. I didn't have that.
and so I could see why, someone could view this as pro capital punishment, because you could see this whole thing as like he was in an insane asylum. He was deemed fit for the public, and he wasn't fit for the public. We should have just killed him when we had the chance, right? You could view it that way, but then you could also view it as just like this like kind of what I get out of it, which is like when you watch it and you're looking at like the murderer as this idea, when he is just a shadow cast upon like a big sign that's saying what he has done. Like, it's so easy to hate him. It's so easy to hate him when you never see his face and you hear him whistling in the Hall of the Mountain King, and he always like kind of stutters and is whistling over that one part. And it's so easy to like hate him. And then like when you finally get a chance to see him as a person, I do see him as a person. And like the cruelty and the punching and the hitting that the people are, you see the violence is just violence. And it's like, whether it's justified or not, like, I think violence is just so ugly. And like, I don't see it as like movie violence. I see it as like violence. And it's like, I find it so challenging. And where like, just seeing a person being the victim of violence, something I don't want to see, even though you have like justified to me numerous times over, this guy has killed children. I don't know how to feel about it. And like, it makes me just all morally complicated inside, where if anybody is, justifiable as like the victim of violence, it's this guy. And yet I don't want to see it. And like, I don't know. That's what I get out of this movie. And that's the ending.
It is fascinating because it doesn't come down either way. It leaves it, I don't know. I guess it leaves it open to a point, but I don't know. I feel like he's getting across. I wish I knew the time period. I wish I knew exactly what he was referencing. Like, I wish I knew what children were going through in this time period. Apparently, this is based on a case that was like another German serial killer, Harman, who was just solved like the year before, like 29. He
Wow.
it was very relevant at the time. But like, because the final scene ends with, it doesn't actually say what the court like decides, but based on the three mothers' response to it and how they literally like look straight at the camera and say, it's up to you. Like, you can kind of imply that he is going to get the insanity plea. He is going to get some kind of help instead of the death penalty. And I don't know. I feel like he's really pushing with those, with the fact that it ends on the mothers, and the fact that in the French version, they gave it a happy ending. They cut out that scene with the mothers, and it cuts, instead of the mothers, calling the audience to arms to be more vigilant in protecting children, it cuts to some happy children playing like in a playground, just like running around. Because that's the first thing they had to do was give it a happy ending, which is very weird and disturbing.
Earlier, you're going back to the French version. I guess that whole thing touches on this whole fad with early talkies, which is in the early days. And I think best known case of this fad is the 1931 Dracula, where you buy the Bela Lugosi Dracula, and it includes the Spanish language Dracula, where it's the same sets, it's the same costumes, the same lighting and everything. It's just that when the Hollywood crew, the American crew would just be done shooting for the day, they would have a new cast and a new crew to show up and film basically what the Americans had shot, but just in a different language. And so you have the Spanish language Dracula. It's just a different version of Dracula, where it's literally the same movie, just in a different language, but it has slightly different camera angles, but it's all the same.
Yeah, that was
stuff.
a form of adapting to sound, because in silent era, it was so much easier. You just change out the title cards and you can ship it all around the world and just make the same movie.
And there is like all this other stuff too, though. Like when it comes to this movie, like they kind of explain like not every movie got the Dracula treatment, where they're filming everything over again with new actors. Sometimes they're dubbing it, you know, sometimes they're recasting actors. Sometimes it is more often than not probably like a patchwork of all these different techniques. So the recycling footage, they're maybe like putting in like new shots that have like different languages here and there. Like it's a very interesting kind of way, like kind of a Wild West version of like, how do we adapt to this new form in like the international market?
Which is weird with a filmmaker like Lang, who is so meticulous in all of his shots. And like apparently that second Laurie monologue in French he didn't even shoot. Like it's completely different, and it's like got it's got a bunch of cutaways. It's edited a lot more back to the crowd instead of just that long lingering shot that we talked about earlier.
Interesting,
because they show it. They show the whole thing in that featurette, which is really cool. So you can watch it.
Cool. I'll seek it out. Yeah, because Lang does a lot of long takes in this. There's that one that you had alluded to earlier where it starts off where you see the beggars sort of organizing, like the cigarettes, or you're in a sandwich shop, and the camera goes all around the sandwich shop, and then it goes out the window, and then it goes up, but then like it's a long shot in and of itself, but then like you sort of see where they're trying to hide a cut where it's going up the building, and then you see through the window in the upper level where they are enlisting the beggars, and then the camera sort of goes into the window, and you can sort of, the idea that it goes through the window, but you can sort of see the window slide a little bit. I love that kind of, you can see the seams, but that's a very early instance of we can't do it all in one take, but we're going to try. And so that kind of predates something like Rope, which Hitchcock, did in the, I think I want to say that's the 50s.
It's coming to 4K this year, right? Part of that volume 3.
Yes, it is.
I'm so excited.
But that predates like all kinds of these, like Magnificent Ambersons, which that's another story. But like, it's just kind of interesting.
We'll get there.
When we get there. Oh my gosh. Magnificent Ambersons will break your heart, just behind the scenes of it. But yeah, there are a lot of long takes, and there's that one, like you said, with Peter Lorre just acting. But you had mentioned earlier that like you were kind of initially really taken by the editing of this movie, and I was too. One of my earliest notes is just all caps, editing! ! Talk to me, like what gripped you about the editing on a first viewing, since that's what you're kind of getting the most out of.
Yeah, it was just very interesting. I think techniques, a lot of techniques that we still use today, like especially with the sound, the voiceover, and the sound bridges, and but then a lot of stuff that we just don't do anymore. Like I don't know, it was very interesting. I need to see more of Lang's stuff. I've only seen this in Metropolis. I've got to watch more of his silent films. There's actually I don't know if it's on the disc, but on the Criterion channel, there's a really cool featurette that's called the Paul Falkenberg Classroom Tapes, which is the editor on this film. And he's like teaching a class, and you can tell they're just watching the movie. He's like, just tell me when to pause and ask questions, and I'll answer questions. He's just like talking while the movie's going on. And he's talking about how much of a perfectionist Lang was, and how Lang was very much involved in the editing. It wasn't just him. He did give Lang some freedom, or he did give Falkenberg some freedom to do some of his own stuff. But one of the biggest things that I never really put together was he was talking about that there was no editors. Sound films created the role of an editor, because directors all edited their own films before that. Like I knew Chaplin did that, but I didn't know like everybody did that. He said there was no need for an editor. All directors could edit, and Lang could edit. The reason that they needed editors was because silent directors were afraid of sound. They didn't know how to do it. They were overwhelmed by it. It's hard to teach old guys new techniques. They don't want to learn that crap. so they got editors to help with sound, and that's where a lot of the sound stuff that I was mentioning earlier was this guy coming in and letting the sound from one scene linger to the next scene, or vice versa, letting the sound come in from the next scene into this scene. It's really interesting. I recommend checking out. It's really hard to hear because it's clearly just like a old recording in a really old classroom setting, but it's cool that we have that recording.
That's awesome. I will, man. It looks like I gotta hop on the featurettes here. I feel so unprepared. Yeah, so I love the editing in this, and I think that like this sort of it's fascinating that you said that like that, or I guess you're recounting him saying that like sound movies basically created the role of the editor, because like this feels like in terms of like the editing, like that feels like the thing that kind of gives us the most historical significance to me, is that like I feel like in a lot of ways we haven't progressed past this movie in terms of editing. There's in the essay here, I guess short essay called "The Mark of M." It's the first one. Stanley Kaufman basically in that piece says that what's interesting is that if the criminals didn't catch Hans Beckert, then the cops are going to do it shortly anyways. Like they both kind of close in on the murderer around the same time. And and this kind of plays into like that kind of provocative, kind of challenging thing that I was kind of mentioning earlier. This ties into that, where it's like, and this is what Kaufman observes, is that like this isn't like a lampooning of the cops. Like this isn't like Keystone Cops, which is like a very popular thing, at least in American cinema, and just in movies in general, like, treating cops as like this joke. It was this idea that like the cops and the robbers are basically, they're equated constantly throughout this movie. I should probably directly quote him because I think he does a good job of explaining it. He says, Lang isn't interested in a facile lampooning of the police as numbskulls. His satirical eye focuses on the kinship between the two stratas.
Yes.
And that is great.
And that ties into the cynical nature of the film that I thought you were going to go into earlier when you went in a different direction. But it is kind of cynical because neither the cops nor the criminals are doing this altruistically because they care about kids. They're doing it because this murder is an inconvenience to them. Like the cops, he's making the cops look bad. People aren't trusting them anymore. It's basically turning into a police state. And then the criminals, I don't even exactly know what's going on. I don't exactly know why it's hurting their reputation, but that's why they're doing it. It's because their
pockets are getting light, And...
Yeah, they can't do anything because the police are everywhere. So that ties in perfectly. Thank you for doing that, because that's the other big editing scene that really stands out, is where we're cutting back and forth. There's two meetings happening at the same time with the police and the criminals, and we keep cutting back and forth between them, showing how similar they are. Like this is exactly what you were just talking about, where like they'll do a hand movement and it'll literally cut to the other team doing the exact same thing, or a push in to the same thing on the other side. And there's just some really cool, and there's also some sound things there where the audio from one scene will come into the other one. We just keep cutting back and forth. There's also like an excessive amount of smoking going on.
Yeah.
So it's like blurring the lines between the two. Like you sometimes can't even tell for a second which group you're looking at, because it keeps cutting back and forth at all. It's so cool.
And it also makes the frame look awesome. Like the imagery, like smoke in the frame looks great. But no, that whole scene is great. Like kind of the sound bridges that you were talking about earlier, those I picked up on those. But like the whole sequence where Beckert is hiding in the attic and the criminals are sieging this office building is one of the most thrilling, gripping, tense scenes. I love all the setups where like you have the setups with like these clocks that need to be checked by the policeman, and there's a payoff with that, but it's more of a subverted one where no one messes that up, but they can be triggered because the watchman is able to reach up and pull an alarm from one of those clocks, but it's not because someone missed the time. That's great. I love the whole scene where like they figure out where he is and they just start busting into the cabinets, and then like instead of quickly editing it of them busting him, it's a long shot just holding on Peter Lorre hiding in the shadows.
Yes.
And you just hear them getting closer and closer. It is so good. It is so good.
And then you find out like 5 minutes, like the cops are going to be there in 5 minutes.
Yes.
And they're like, okay, we're doing this. It's so good. Yeah, I think I definitely had the same thing as you, where I was like appreciating the first half. But it is a little more procedural and a little more slow. And even though, like I said, the editing keeps the pace going really well. But yeah, once he gets his last victim and that whole the beggars scene starts, it never lets up. Like it just keeps going all the way to the end.
Well, and I kind of playing back into that kind of cynical nature. Yeah, like I guess like I don't know, it's easy to say this all in hindsight, but I think like art is contextual, and I think what we can appreciate can be looked at in this way. But it is just kind of like eerie to kind of see early scenes of police state, and like I wish like you I knew more about the rise of the Nazi party in Germany, but it does feel like it could have been made after the fact, and is like equating this sort of like, okay, there is a fear of child murder. No one wants child murder. And yet the police are almost like contributing to this air of paranoia. And there is like this sort of like authoritarian imagery of like all the cops marching down the street, and like almost like they are like an army. Like they're and like when they're like carting away all the people in the paddy wagons, like, yeah, it kind of reminds, like it brings to mind like people getting carted away to concentration camps. Like it does elicit these types.
And I think that's part of the rewriting of history that Lang does, where that they didn't rise to power for like 2 more years, but he kind of talks about it like he was fighting the Nazis already or something like that.
But that's one of those things where if you have the interpretation that the Nazi party did, it's easy to look at the police and be like, we just got to be like that. but like
they don't catch them. They're kind of bumbling in this. Like the criminals do it better.
Like, yeah, and that's true. But like, but it is kind of interesting though. Like when you see the criminals and like how
they're so smart. Like that was brilliant to use the beggars. Like
yes, oh yeah, it's great. That's the other thing. So there are two big things here that I want to highlight. The one of them is I really like Lang is just like a scene constructionist. That scene where like we first meet like the kind of the heads of the criminal organization, where that scene starts where they're looking out a window and you see the paddy wagons taking away, all the criminals. Well, not even criminals, just people hanging out in criminal districts. That's something that in hindsight maybe feels more, you can rewrite history if you want to. But like the criminal districts, you can see them taking away 2 paddy wagons. And it's just a cool transition to be like, okay, these characters are observing the effects of the previous scene. But then when the character of Safecracker is introduced, the first thing he does is like, close the windows, what are you doing? And it's a great thing that informs the character of, oh, he's even more alert than these characters. He's pretty cool. But it also just adds a sense of symmetry to the scene of like, the scene started with windows and now we are kind of transitioning into the second part of this scene where we are closing the windows. It's just a good detail. I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like I kind of have no idea if he's trying to say anything with this movie, or if he is just trying to present all these weird sides and make you decide. Like, because there's the thing where he goes into, because you kind of like the criminals, like the criminals are effective and smarter than the police, but then he completely flips that at the end when he's like, when he does the monologue and he says how much worse a criminal who can do good and chooses not to is than a troubled, mentally ill person.
Yeah.
So I don't know what he's saying. Like, and I've listened to a few different videos on this movie, and like people seem to be getting completely different takeaways from it. So,
well, and that's what I think makes it such a kind of a good like observation.
I feel like I could watch this in 10 years and have a completely different.
And I think that's honestly probably why it informed film noir so much. Film noir is like noted for how
great it is.
How great, yeah, and like in terms of like no one's really a good guy, and that's not everybody's cup of tea, and I understand why. But I think in something like this, like it's provocative in a way that doesn't feel like it's just playing whataboutism. Like I do think it's saying kind of something about the nature of humanity and cruelty, where like it's interesting that the criminals offer 5,000 more marks than the police do, right? Like there's something there, but like what's interesting is like when you have the police doing the raids and doing all that stuff, you realize they're only doing that because someone in a meeting was like, okay, we got to catch this criminal. Who's got ideas? And they're all just kind of throwing ideas out. Make the ID checks even more. Make the reward more. Do this. Like, yeah. And they're like, oh, that's probably why these police are acting the way they are. It's because someone just had to they had to have an idea at a meeting. Like,
well, and they're just trying to act like they're doing something. Like that scene is interesting. Lohman like knows all of those people. Like as they're coming through with the ID checks, he's like winking at some of them and like laughing. Like it seems like he knows these kids, and he's just like, do a better job next time. Like he's just like, it seems like they're just going through the motions just to seem like so people think the police are trying to solve this, even though they don't really have any leads. They're not really accomplishing anything until it's handed to them by the criminals at the end.
Yeah. One other thing about Lang's storytelling here that I like is he does this kind of recurring storytelling motif, where he'll like just kind of it's like a little coda for scenes where early on you'll have the whole sequence with Elsie Beckman, and he'll cut to these environmental shots where they're mostly still, and then he'll have a little payoff with movement. So early on, there's one with Elsie Beckman where you're hearing her mom call out her name, and we're cutting to all these little like environmental shots where it's like clothes hanging in an attic and her, empty plate at the dining table, and, all these different locations that you maybe have spent some time seeing for the last handful of minutes. And then the payoff is you have a still image of a grass, like a lawn or something. And then you see her ball roll into frame. Mm-hmm. And it's finally you get some movement, and then it cuts to the balloon getting caught in the power lines.
The creepy balloon.
And it's so haunting. It's great. And then later, once they've like the raid is over,
he does it again.
But he does it again. Yeah, it's like it feels like this wonderful little accent to the sequence, but it's also kind of shifting POV, because this isn't just character, like this is probably what the police are seeing when they're arriving.
Yeah, you can see like, oh wow, they messed up this building. Like you're seeing all these walls they broke into, and
you're seeing like the attic is trashed. There's like a hole in the ground. There's like all this like night watchmen are like strung up, and then finally the payoff there is we get movement, and it's the one criminal who got left behind, where he moves into frame, and he's like, hey, you guys took the rope up. Where's my rope?
Why did they pull the rope up? Like they left the entire place in shambles. Just leave the rope down there. I don't understand why they pulled the rope up.
I don't know. I guess it just happens, but yeah, no, like that's a really cool thing. And I like that choice he does, where it does sort of make you look at stuff and that you've been spent the last however long watching, and you get a chance to kind of just reflect on it. I don't know. I like how he uses that.
Real quick with that, like the guy who gets caught and he eventually gives away the location of the kangaroo court because Lohman comes in and like threatens him. There's like one scene, speaking of silent acting, there's like one scene of like straight up weird comedy right there where when he finds out, he's like, oh, and drops his cigar out of his mouth and like, oh, and then like picks it up. It's very weird, but I don't know. I guess maybe Lang just liked that performance because it's very jarring from the rest of the tone. It was fun.
No, it was. There's some decent comic relief in this. Yeah, and I do actually like how, this is one of the earliest movies that I saw where I'm like, oh, like there isn't really a main character here. The star is Fritz Lang. Like he's the star of the movie. But that being said, there are still like very movie-ish characters, and I think that kind of plays into his German expressionist roots that were all through his silent movies that I really respond to. Like I've just always thought Safecracker was awesome. Like I love that guy's face. I love like he's got this leather jacket with the collar popped and like the bowler hat. Like he looks like he's such a movie character. When you open up the Blu-ray and you look at the disc, which is in my player, I guess you can hold it up. It's him holding up a picture, and I love just the design of the character. There he is, right there. Yeah, that's him. I like Lohman as just sort of like this big guy, and he's kind of funny. Like in the big meeting scene, he kind of talks about how, you know, everyone's so quick to you know, claim that they saw like a piece of, you know, evidence, but the second you want to ask them about, you know, actual evidence, all of a sudden they can't remember any. Like his performance is really good. I like what's the name, Franz, the criminal who gets caught. Like his hair is all big and bushy looking. Like there's like a level of like iconic quality that like does remind me of the silent movies. Like I don't know, I really like how that does sort of carry over. And it's not like everyone is clinically bland, you know, like it's not just like,
no,
there
it's
is a level
very iconic. It's like, maybe it's just I watched it twice in one day, but I think it's definitely going to stick with me a lot, especially a lot of the visuals are amazing. And also, real quick, before we end, this movie ruined In the Hall of the Mountain King for me. Like, I like that song, and now it's like so creepy. Because I watched it twice in one day, I took my kids to like a park today, and I was just whistling it because it's just stuck in my head, and I was like, I feel like such a creep right now whistling this at a park with a bunch of kids around me.
That was one thing I thought while I was watching this, is I just picked it because of the After Hours sort of thematic connection there, and then I'm watching like, oh, DJ's a dad. I probably come off like a weirdo who's like, oh, we're gonna watch a movie about child murder. Apologies for the Seth Rogen impression there.
Oh wow, that's exactly what that was. Yeah, the song, the sound is very creepy. I love that. I mean, making it a sound movie, like I said, actually intentionally using the sound, like the whole thing revolves around sound because that's how he gets caught. It's not just like using sound as a crutch. That's something I noticed more on the first viewing. Because you don't know you're supposed to sympathize with him at all until the very end. But on the second viewing, you can see it earlier. Like you have that scene where he's like trying to hold it. He's trying to restrain himself and like hold it back in the window where her reflection is like in a square of knives, which is the craziest shot.
And his that reverse shot's amazing too, because it's a reflection of a diamond shape of knives being reflected into the mirror. So he's got that frame within the frame, and she's got that. It's amazing, and
it's all in one shot. Like it's a pan. It's nuts. And then, but so you get him like trying to hold it back. You get him whistling. The whistling is like uncontrollable. Like the first time you see it, you think he's just a creep and he's like enjoying this. But the whistling is like, it like comes out of him. It's like the other side of him. Because you can tell, because he's kind of like faltering and like trying to stop, but he can't stop it.
Yeah.
And then you've also got like,
that's another great one take scene where he goes to that restaurant to like
as soon as he sees her, he tries to drink it away with a couple shots and tries to like get past it, and he just can't. And like I said, the opening shot where he's listening to what they're saying about him on the radio, and he's like play acting at being what they're saying he is. Like he's trying to act crazy, like he's like and like it's so strange. Like you pick up so much more on that, of like how tortured and messed up he is on repeat viewings, and we don't know why. Like that's really interesting that he doesn't. It might be from the war, like that's what people speculate, like him being forced to kill in the war and not wanting to do that, and then the demons keep coming back, but we don't know.
That's interesting.
It leaves it completely open.
And I'm sure there are probably going to be a lot of people maybe who listen to this discussion and think, how are you guys not talking about Peter Lorre more? Like he's so good in this, and we're kind of running out of time now, but like he is so good. He's amazing. I love him. I really like this movie, and it's like, I don't know if it might someday be on my list of like personal favorites. It doesn't like reach through and like grab me the way a lot of my favorites do, but I would be lying if I said this is not if this was not a massive influence on me at a very early age. And welcome to the club, because In the Hall of the Mountain King has been ruined for me forever. So yeah.
yeah, it's very creepy now with that context, but who knows? Maybe I'll reclaim it someday. But no, I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed the wrong word, but I really enjoyed learning about this film, and thank you for bringing it to my attention and having us do this, because I had a great. I almost said I had a great time. It's hard to explain my experience with this because it's not a great time. It's not enjoyable.
But it kind of is, though. Like when you're like that whole scene where they are raiding it's gripping and it's thrilling and it's legitimately entertaining. And you're like, you have to catch yourself and you're like, am I seriously being entertained by this subject matter? Like that's again, going back to that quote by A.O. Scott. That's what I love about movies. It's like that warping effect that it has on you. And I think Lang is kind of like the master of, in this anyway, like just warping your perspective to like kind of whoever is in charge of the narrative. It's really impressive stuff.
Yeah, it's a great experience, and I highly recommend it. You will not need your phone. Like, it drives me crazy when I feel like people can't watch older movies unless they have their phone in their hand. Like, you won't. Just watch it. You'll be on the edge of your seat, especially in that second half. But yeah, that is Criterion Corner number 8. Thank you for choosing that. No idea what I'm going to pick for the next one. We got this one out quick. We just did After Hours a few weeks ago. So hopefully we can keep this going. The biggest obstacle right now is the technical difficulties. If not for those, I feel like we could pump these out much more often. So hopefully we can figure that out in the near future, and we can keep doing these because I like these. I'm glad we're doing these again. I wish I had more time to live with this before we talked about it, but I still really enjoyed talking about it. So
it's okay. I'm glad you got as much out of it as you did, and I'm glad you brought as much of this to the discussion because you're talking about stuff that I didn't even really look at, and so I thought it was a quality discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I got a crash course with those bonus features. We'll see how much of it sticks with me because I crammed all of it into one day, but. But thanks, guys, for listening. Hope you enjoyed the conversation, and let us know in the comments what you think of this film. And actually, we didn't talk about this last time, but go ahead and recommend some things in the comments of what you want us to watch. We go back and forth on this, so I'm going to pick the next one. But if you want to recommend some things, we've taken recommendations before. I know we did Monsieur Lowe's Holiday, based completely on a recommendation, and we both love that film. So
it's great.
Let us know which ones you want us to talk about next. Hopefully you enjoy this format. It's not really a review. If you haven't seen this film, you have no idea what we're talking about because we didn't really explain it at all. We just jump right in feet first for people who have already seen it. So maybe this isn't the best format for numbers, but we don't care about numbers. We just we do it for ourselves. We enjoy talking about films together, and I always have a blast with you, buddy. So thanks again for doing this, and we will be back again for the next episode real soon.